Welcome to the Deep Dive, where I uploaded my transcript for the podcast and have two AI hosts talk about it. They may go into more depth than I went into. So without further ado, here's the Deep Dive.
Welcome back, everybody. We're diving into some listener-submitted research this time on a pretty interesting topic.
Oh, yeah, this should be fun.
It's all about the parallels between vampire myths and, those self-centered personalities we all come across in life.
Right.
You sent over some audio lectures on this. Sounds like it's going to be a fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, it's amazing how these fictional archetypes, I think, can really give us like a whole new perspective on actual human behavior.
Yeah, totally. It's like we're using this ancient folklore to make sense of, I don't know, some of the more puzzling behaviors we all deal with sometimes. Mm-hmm. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I'm curious, how did this idea even come about? Like connecting vampires to real people, where did it all begin?
Well, the whole vampire thing has been around for centuries, right? It's got roots in all these different cultures, Eastern Europe, Greece, even China. Right. And a lot of times these myths, they reflected some very real fears, you know?
Like what kind of fears?
Like death and disease, exploitation, but, it was all wrapped up in this supernatural package.
So they weren't just tea about like scary creatures in the night.
Right, exactly.
There was something deeper going on.
Absolutely. And all those classic vampire traits, the immortality, the feeding off others, that fear of sunlight. It wasn't just random stuff they threw in there.
Right.
Those were symbolic. They represented certain anxieties, power dynamics, all that.
Okay, so that makes sense. But how do we go from, ancient stories to applying this to people we might actually know?
It's all about seeing those parallels. Like, take immortality.
Okay.
On the surface level, yeah, it's about living forever.
Right.
But there's a deeper psychological level to it, too. Mm-hmm. It represents this yearning to escape vulnerability, this rejection of the natural cycle of life and death.
And I can see how that ties into, like, people who are super self-centered. It's like they're always searching for that external validation, that life force to feel okay. Powerful.
Yeah, exactly. They've got this sort of emotional greed, this need for attention and praise that's never really satisfied. They might fear aging, and not just physically.
Ah, I see.
Emotionally, too. Always wanting that youthful feeling of being the center of attention.
It's like they're stuck in this loop, always needing more, never really content. Which brings us to the next big vampire thing. Feeding off of others, but obviously not literally.
Right.
Not talking about blood here.
No. In this sense, it's about what we call emotional feeding. These folks, they thrive on taking, not giving. They drain the emotional energy of everyone around them.
Oh, I know the type.
They might dominate conversations, always bringing it back to themselves, or just constantly needing support and validation, but never giving any back.
I bet everyone listening right now is picturing someone they know.
Probably. And that's why it's so important to understand this, so we can recognize the patterns and protect our own energy.
Okay, so we've got immortality, the need for validation. We've got feeding, this one-sided emotional exchange. What about fear of sunlight? Where does that fit in with real people?
Well, sunlight, think of it metaphorically. It represents truth, exposure.
Okay.
Vampires fear it because it reveals who they truly are, their flaws. It's the same with self-centered individuals.
Okay.
They often go to great lengths to avoid any self-reflection, anything that challenges their carefully constructed self-image.
So like they're living in a bubble, surrounded by mirrors, showing them only what they want to see.
Exactly.
Any criticism is like a stake to the heart.
You got it. And they might use tactics like deflection, blame shifting, or even gaslighting to keep up that facade. If you confront them with the truth, watch out.
Why? What happens?
It triggers this intense defensiveness or flat out denial because it threatens their control, their feeling of superiority.
You mentioned gaslighting. Maybe we should pause on that for a sec. For those who aren't familiar, what does that even mean? How does it play out in these dynamics?
Sure. Gaslighting is basically a form of manipulation. It's where someone tries to make you question your own perceptions, your reality.
Oh, wow.
They might deny things you know to be true, twist your words around, or even make you feel like you're going crazy. It's all about undermining your confidence, making you dependent on them for validation.
That's messed up. And it makes it even harder to break free from their influence because you start to doubt yourself.
Exactly. You start questioning your own judgment. That's why recognizing these tactics is so crucial. It lets us see through the manipulation, reclaim our own sense of what's real.
Okay, so To recap, we've got these three big themes: this insatiable hunger for validation, the parasitic emotional feeding, and the fear of truth and exposure. It really does paint a picture of how this mythical archetype can be applied to actual behavior.
And as we get into the specifics, I think you'll see how these parallels become even more striking.
Okay, I am ready to go deeper into this. Let's unpack some of those specific vampire traits and see how they play out in the real world.
Let's do it. Welcome back. We've been talking about these parallels between vampire myths and self-centered personalities.
Right, those emotional vampires.
Yeah. Now let's talk about how you can protect yourself from them, because let's be real, these are the people who can really drain your energy.
Okay, I am all ears because you mentioned earlier we need more than just boundaries. You said something about barriers.
Yes. While boundaries are important in any relationship, sometimes, especially when you're dealing with people who are constantly disregarding them, you need something stronger.
Okay.
Think of boundaries as like guidelines for respectful interactions, which work great in most situations, but barriers are like firm walls, non-negotiables, specifically designed to block those who are chronically self-centered.
So it's like boundaries are the first line of defense, but sometimes you need to reinforce them.
Yes, precisely. Self-centered people, they thrive on testing limits. They push those boundaries to see how much they can get away with. Barriers, they send a very clear message. Do not cross this line.
Okay, I'm starting to see the difference here. But how do we actually build these barriers? What are the concrete steps?
Well, the first thing is you need to identify your non-negotiables. What behaviors are absolutely unacceptable to you? What situations consistently drain your energy? What leaves you feeling depleted?
It's about recognizing those patterns, those red flags that tell you this is not okay.
Exactly. It's about understanding your own needs and limits. Once you've pinpointed those non-negotiables, the next step is being unwavering in enforcing them.
And that's where it gets tricky, right? Especially when you're dealing with someone who's really good at manipulating or guilt tripping.
It can be challenging, but remember, you have the power to choose how you respond. Barriers aren't suggestions, they're rules. You don't have to get into long explanations or justifications. You can simply state your barrier calmly and clearly, and then follow through with consequences if it's ignored.
Okay, so consequences are key. What are some examples that might actually work?
Well, it really depends on the dynamic, the severity of the behavior. Some common ones might include limiting contact, ending the conversation, or even removing yourself from the relationship completely, if necessary.
So backing up our words with actions, showing that we mean business.
Exactly. Consistency is crucial. If you give in, if you let them cross the line, even once, it sends the message that it's negotiable and they'll keep pushing.
It's like training a dog. You have to be firm and consistent or they won't learn.
That's a good analogy. But remember, the goal isn't to punish or control the other person. It's about taking care of yourself, creating a space for you to thrive.
That makes sense. It's about self-preservation. But how do we actually communicate these barriers? Like those conversations can be so awkward.
I agree, it can be uncomfortable, but clarity is essential. You need to be direct and specific about what the barriers are and what the consequences will be if they're crossed. You can say something like, I need to be clear that if you continue to, and then insert the behavior, I will need to, and then insert the consequence to protect myself.
So for example, if you continue to interrupt me when I'm speaking, I'm going to end the conversation.
Exactly. Or, if you continue to talk about yourself without asking about my day, I'm going to limit our phone calls to once a week.
So it's all about setting those expectations and consequences. But how do we know if it's actually working? What are the signs?
Pay attention to their reaction, both verbal and nonverbal. If they acknowledge your boundary, even grudgingly, and they make a genuine effort to change their behavior, that's a positive sign.
So even if they don't sound thrilled, if they say something like, okay, I'll try to do better, it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, it shows they're at least willing to listen. But if they become defensive, dismissive, or try to manipulate you into backing down, those are red flags.
Oh yeah, like what?
They might say things like, you're being too sensitive, or you're making a big deal out of nothing.
It's a classic minimizing, invalidation.
Exactly. Pay attention to body language, too. Are they crossing their arms, rolling their eyes, avoiding eye contact? All of that tells you a lot about how they're really responding.
It's like we're becoming emotional detectives.
Kind of. It's about becoming more attuned to those signals, trusting your gut. Now, what if, despite your best efforts, the person continues to disregard those barriers? What if they keep crossing the lines, keep draining your energy?
That's what I was thinking about. because it feels like sometimes no matter what you do, some people just won't change.
That's when you have to consider whether distance is necessary. It might mean limiting contact, reducing the frequency of interactions, or even stepping away from the relationship altogether.
That's a hard decision, though, especially if it's someone you care about.
I understand. But you have the right to protect your well-being, even if it means creating distance from someone who is consistently hurting you.
Right. It's not about being selfish. It's about self-preservation.
Exactly. And sometimes creating that space, that distance, is what allows the other person to finally see the impact of their actions.
It gives them the chance to reflect, maybe even to seek help if they're willing. And if they don't, well, at least we've protected ourselves.
But setting and enforcing those barriers, it can be emotionally draining. It's not always easy to stand up for yourself, especially when you're dealing with someone who's manipulative or controlling.
It can be lonely, like you're fighting this battle on your own.
That's why having a strong support system is crucial. Talk to trusted friends, family, or even a therapist. Share your experiences. Get support.
Like building a protective circle around ourselves.
Exactly. You don't have to go through this alone.
This is also helpful. You know, when we started out talking about vampires, I never thought we'd end up with practical advice on setting boundaries.
It's amazing what we can learn from those ancient myths, isn't it?
I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of how to deal with these types of people. You know, how to protect myself.
It's been a really fascinating exploration, but we're not done yet. There's one more powerful parallel we need to talk about, and it has to do with the significance of numbers.
Okay, I am intrigued. Let's dive into that in the final part of our vampire-themed deep dive. Okay, we're back, ready to wrap up our vampire deep dive. You were saying something about numbers before the break.
Right. This is something that I think offers a lot of hope, actually. You know how in pretty much every vampire story, humans always outnumber the vampires?
Yeah, that's true. You never really see vampires taking over the world completely.
Exactly. And I think that same idea applies to those self-centered folks we've been talking about.
Oh, interesting.
They might seem all-powerful in their own little circles.
Right.
But in reality, they're a minority. Most people are capable of empathy, compassion, genuine connection.
So even though it can feel like those emotional vampires are everywhere, they're not actually the norm.
Nope. Their influence is limited. They can only control those who let themselves be controlled, and they can only drain the energy of those who give them access.
So it's kind of like a numbers game. The more we recognize these patterns, set those boundaries, the less power they have over us as a whole.
Exactly. It's about realizing our collective strength. Think about those vampire stories, right? Humans often band together to protect themselves, fight back. We can do the same in our own lives, support each other, share our experiences, learn from each other's strategies.
I love that. It's like we're forming our own little vampire hunting posse.
Right. And we're armed with garlic, sunlight, a whole lot of healthy boundaries.
This whole deep dive has been so eye-opening. I came in thinking about spooky creatures, but I'm leaving with a whole new understanding of how to deal with difficult people.
It's amazing what we can learn from these old myths. The big takeaway here is awareness is power. Once you see the patterns, you can start changing things for the better.
So to anyone listening, if you've ever felt alone dealing with someone super self-centered, always draining your energy, remember, you are not alone. And together, we can create a world where that kind of emotional vampirism has no place.
Absolutely. Protect your energy, set those healthy boundaries, and never underestimate the power of connecting with others.
This has been another incredible deep dive. Until next time, everyone,